What other option is there other than to trust life? To endlessly struggle and fight against it? I'm going to assume right now that you're in a safe location, maybe in your home or your car, or you're maybe on a walk, or maybe at work on break, and you're just kind of watching this video. Who knows? I'm going to assume that overall you're safe. A lot of your survival needs are actually generally taken care of, and there's no one coming to harm you. There's enough food in your stomach. You have a shelter over your head, or at least you can get to one. And simply, you're quite safe. There's no immediate threats that need to put you into survival mode, but yet you still find yourself struggling against life. You still find yourself in this perpetual state of like battling against life. Fundamentally, you're just fighting life moment by moment, and it's this constant uphill battle rather than this rhythm and flow with life. Regardless of what's happening, there's always this resistance. There's this struggle. There's got to be some sort of continuous, unnecessary suffering, and we can't just trust life. And I want to kind of just explore a little bit what's going on here. I want to just kind of dive into this experience because this is very common on planet Earth. There's a lot of us who simply don't need to just be stuck in survival mode, but we never really go beyond it. We never really move up to higher levels of consciousness, like self-actualization and self-transcendence. We're always kind of just stuck at self-esteem, or like spiral dynamics stage green. If any of you are familiar with spiral dynamics, we never really make it to those higher levels. We're always just kind of stuck in our survival-oriented perceptions and patterns. And it's a shame when you actually have to live life like this for the rest of your life, because life isn't really meant to just be surviving it. Life is pretty beautiful when you can begin to move beyond just survival. Not that it always feels positive, not that it always feels pleasurable, but that your perception of life begins to become more accurate. And that your ability to relate to life due to this new perception of it, your ability to relate to life simply gets better. That regardless of what's happening, you can kind of learn to just trust it. Whether you lose a loved one or your family dog, or whether you get laid off from work or you go through a breakup, there's this continuous ability to just simply trust life rather than always needing to fight against it, manipulate it, seize control of it, dominate it, etc. You can kind of just detect that there's this sort of underlying intelligence to life that you can actually just trust. And again, it doesn't mean that you're always going to just feel endless pleasure, because that's a very sort of immature idea of like human fulfillment and human life, that like I just need to feel endless pleasure. But I'm talking about a more mature sort of path here. One that actually begins to embrace the full spectrum of life while letting go of the struggle, the unnecessary struggle against it. The struggle that's not needed, the struggle that we perpetuate unconsciously because we're simply stuck in survival mode. So let's talk a little bit about surrender versus struggle. We have resistance, which creates a lot of suffering. It's this sort of struggling against life's flow. Trying to control or resist what's happening only amplifies stress and tension. It kind of just becomes this unnecessary burning of energy, and it's exhausting. We have to put in a lot of energy to always be controlling and manipulating and fighting and resisting and struggling against. It's very blatantly exhausting. It's just not a comfortable way of living life. And our body actually tells us this through a lot of our suffering, through a lot of our unnecessary suffering, that there's just something not working. Kind of like if you break your arm and it's in pain, right? Your body's telling you through pain, hey, we just broke our arm. We have to get this thing fixed because there's going to be a lot of problems if we don't. Same thing with a lot of the sort of emotional and psychological suffering, right? This unnecessary suffering that I'm talking about in this video. Our body will actually tell us about it, and it'll say, hey, you're not relating to this properly. You're exerting too much energy fighting against it rather than learning to just kind of let go and open up to life. You're spending too much time in habitual states of closure, fear, and survival rather than learning to open up to it. So here comes in the power of surrender. Letting go and trusting life doesn't mean simply giving up. It means aligning with life's natural intelligence rather than always fighting against it. It means aligning with the flow of life rather than always needing to push and pull on it, like you're probably very familiar with. And of course, in your experience, I can guarantee you that it actually becomes a source of deep suffering and unnecessary exhaustion. So I want to talk about the nervous system very briefly. Our nervous system, especially a dysregulated nervous system, keeps you in fight, flight, freeze, making you view life through the lens of fear and scarcity. This is survival mode. This is a very core element of survival mode. And a regulated state is when your nervous system is kind of calm and balanced. You're more open to seeing life's beauty, intelligence, and flow. And it's not that an unregulated state or a dysregulated state is like we can't ever go in it, because it has value. It's just that our nervous system gets stuck in fight, flight, freeze, right? It's pretty valuable to be in a state of, let's say, flight when a car is coming at you head on and you didn't see it and you get that burst of energy and you jump out of the way. Of course, that's very valuable. But when we're stuck in that and we don't return back to that regulated state, now we have a problem. Now we're stuck in that unregulated state of just fight, flight, freeze, and our energy gets sort of spent in all sorts of weird directions, like overeating or avoiding emotions, doom scrolling, as they say nowadays, always on our phones, always looking for distractions, entertainment, having poor connections, making a bunch of poor decisions, for example. We're just fundamentally not giving our energy into things that actually come back to make us feel alive and healthy, right? We're eating junk food. We're zoning out to a TV. We're zoning out to screens for 10 hours a day, right? It's like we're sort of just recreating all these sort of sickening states because we are afraid to just kind of open up to life. We can't find that way back to regulation, so we have to just distract ourselves from our pain. So I'll talk about practical regulation. Things like mindfulness, meditation, and breath work can help regulate the nervous system and create that inner sense of safety that begins to move you out of survival mode. And if you're watching this video, you have excess energy to put into something other than survival. You don't have to go out and get water or hunt and then bring the meat back to your tribe. And right? Like, we're not living in those times anymore. If you're watching this video, you are most likely, right? You're most likely safe and you have excess energy to give to something other than just surviving for the next 24 hours. You have time and energy to spend into something beyond just your survival, which is a big deal because as human beings, it took us hundreds of thousands of years to even get to the point where we can move beyond survival. There's, of course, still people living in the world nowadays who are only focused on the next 24 hours, and they will be in that mode for the rest of their life because their survival conditions call for that, so their minds have to continuously adapt to those conditions. Again, if you're watching this video, you're probably not in that set of conditions. So the nervous system really impacts our worldview, and our survival instincts aren't always true. Our survival perceptions are actually typically very false. They actually skew reality. They make it very biased and unclear so that we can further our survival agenda, get power, resources, status, sex, approval, things like this. So your nervous system evolved for survival, not truth. So it often paints an inaccurate or overly negative picture of reality. Our brain actually has a sort of negativity bias as well, so that we're always just kind of anxious. We're actually like looking for something to go wrong proactively rather than kind of just learning to open up to life and just simply trust it. Because if we're always on the lookout for something to go wrong, when something finally does go wrong, we caught it really fast. And this is a good way of reinforcing a belief that like the world is bad and it's always just dangerous and it's always just this horrible, scary place. And that's just what the world is. It's just fundamentally that, right? The fundamental nature of reality is that it's a bad, horrible place, right? It's like people can have beliefs that, right, they have to be anxious because if they're not, something's going to go wrong. And that this belief kind of fuels the anxiety, and it's like this sort of feedback mechanism of like something's going to go wrong, feeling that sense of anxiety, and then like always being hyper vigilant. And then when that thing actually does go wrong, you use that to kind of reinforce the whole cycle that you're in. And it's this kind of just bubble of delusion. But when you're really stuck in that perception, it doesn't seem like that. And the reason why I'm kind of really giving you this example right now is because in many ways that's actually you. In many ways, there's all sorts of ways where you're stuck in that kind of repetitive pattern. You don't even notice it. You're like a fish in water. And then you actually just want to reinforce it over and over and over and over again. And you're confused thinking that this is actually truth. This is just how life works. This is just how life has to be. This is just what it is. How many times have you heard that? This is just how the world works. That's just how it is, right? Whenever something like that gets said, 99% of the time, I'd recommend really just questioning that. So we have a lot of deceptive perceptions. When we're in survival mode, and even when we're in neutral situations, everything just kind of feels threatening, distorting your ability to simply trust life. Have you ever just kind of sat in a room by yourself and you start feeling anxiety? So you have to start distracting yourself with the next stimulating thing, phone, TV, junk food, eating because you're bored, etc. And even just totally neutral situation, like sitting in your room by yourself, nothing really happening. That's for some reason starts to generate anxiety. Right, so it's kind of interesting. Moving on, we have self-deception and the separate self. So we actually have a lot of tensions in our body that we hold physiologically in order to kind of defend ourselves against life, defend ourselves against the external environment, situations we don't like, but also to block the flow of energy and sensation in our body so that we don't have to feel emotions, feel pain that we've once repressed. So it's like we're kind of struggling against ourselves and the world simultaneously. And these physical tensions reinforce the illusion of this sort of separate self, this ego, who is totally distinct from the environment and completely unconnected to it, disconnected from it, and that's just it. This kind of keeps you stuck in this sort of me versus the world, self versus other paradigm, which is very survival oriented. Our whole sense of self is constructed in order to survive. It holds a lot of survival value to have a strong sense of separate self because now we can assert ourselves onto other, not give a crap about our our actions and how it affects other people because, well, you know, if I have a strong sense of self, I just have to survive. This selfishness becomes very useful for survival. Right? I don't use the word selfish in a very like moral way, just more so noticing what our focus is always on. It's on the self. It's on the ego a lot, getting what we need in order to survive. There's healthy selfishness and unhealthy selfishness. Let's make that distinction. So this sort of illusion of the separate self keeps you stuck in this sort of self versus other mindset. And this kind of tension in the body is very responsible for that. There's a lot of points of view that you can take on this, but a very direct one is that your continuous guard against reality and resistance to it actually keeps up this struggle, because this tension in your body actually holds emotions and energy and beliefs and like the certain aspects of your psyche in that tension. For example, when you're young, you can have some kind of troubling situation happen to you that is uncomfortable, and then you kind of tense up to not have to face those feelings, and then it becomes this sort of rigid holding pattern, let's say in your gut. And now that interaction and the energy of that interaction, the beliefs and that way of relating to that interaction, all that actually gets frozen and stuck inside of you. That's kind of how trauma works. Whenever something is like wounded, it kind of like freezes in time and it gets like stuck there, kind of replaying itself out. And until it's kind of, you know, thawed out through the power of our own awareness and, you know, cultivating self-compassion, until we're really able to do that, a lot of our sort of wounds just kind of get stuck there and they just replay themselves. So that troubled relationship to person with a very masculine or feminine essence that can replay itself. This relationship to your own feelings that's always just avoidance that replays itself. The relationship to food, right? That avoids that replays itself. So all this stuff just gets stored inside of us in various ways, and then it just kind of replays itself in this sort of autopilot-like fashion where it doesn't really say, hey, I'm replaying myself. You just kind of find yourself stuck in this loop of feeling insecure, feeling anxious, let's say having very poor spending habits, always needing distractions, always being reactive in relationships and having really bad relationships. Like all this stuff it just never seems to go away. It all just kind of gets stuck there. So the tension skews how you experience reality, making it harder to trust life and to see its inherent interconnectedness. And releasing this tension requires somatic practices that can help dissolve a lot of that physical tension that feeds self-deception and fosters the illusion of separation. You can look into somatic psychology, somatic therapy. There's a book I have. Maybe I have it right around here. Yeah, I do. Aligned, Relaxed, Resilient. Just read this book. Right? This is like top tier work on what I've recently just been speaking about. Also the work of Judith Blackstone. Very good. Moving on is just learning to trust the ups and downs of life. So life, has very pleasurable aspects and then not so pleasurable aspects. And it's not about attaching yourself rigidly to anything. It's about learning to ride life, learning to ride the flow of life without needing to resist it. And counterintuitively, by allowing yourself to, let's say, sink into the feeling of shame when it arises, or let's say you go through a breakup and you experience grief, to really allow yourself to dive deeply into that experience becomes far more wholesome and just feels a lot better than always needing to avoid it or becoming sort of rigid and tense due to you not being able to kind of like process those feelings and kind of just move into a state of acceptance with it. So by always just needing to avoid the downs of life, we actually restrict the ups as well. We actually block our own ability to feel pleasure and happiness and to be open to life because we're just so fundamentally afraid of it. We're kind of blocking out all of life and we're kind of just numbing ourselves and leaving ourselves available only to a very small amount of the whole spectrum, of experience. So life's sort of experience, of course, includes both high highs and low lows, joy and pain, for example. And avoiding challenges or fearing change blocks you from fully engaging with life. Going through the downs is something I got to kind of mention. So there's a lot of growth when it comes to the downs, like I was just talking about. Life struggles often contain lessons and opportunities for growth, even if they're uncomfortable. And there's this sort of underlying element that when you're actually able to kind of trust the flow of life by embracing both highs and lows, you can just learn to see life's inherent wisdom and rhythm. And this is kind of where you begin to find the freedom of trusting life. So it's like from fear to freedom, right? You kind of just start to perceive yourself as like this separate ego in this world who's always tense and afraid and kind of rigid, to learning to just like open up to life, because the suffering of just being closed unconsciously just gets too great and it kind of like cracks you open. So from fear to freedom, fear keeps you clinging to control, but trusting life frees you to respond with creativity and openness. Fear keeps you tense, keeps you closed down, keeps you continuously stuck. And then practicing trusting life allows you to just open up over time to the point where it just becomes natural, to the point where you don't have a problem just kind of stepping out of the way and allowing it to sort of align itself, right? And stepping out of the way doesn't always mean being passive. Sometimes when you step out of the way, you actually feel pushed and compelled to do something. But you're not stuck in this sort of overly controlling, overly asserting mode. You know how to balance life. You know how to dance with it. You know how to step back and let go, and you know how to assert yourself when it's needed. This sort of adaptability and flexibility that gets built. So letting go of avoidance is very important for actually just kind of trusting life. Trusting life means meeting challenges head on, knowing they're part of the flow, not obstacles to happiness, not obstacles that you need to like get rid of But the challenge is, and just learning to surrender into them as they arise, right? Surrender not meaning like giving up, but just non-resistance to them. This allows you to actually build resilience and actually build meaningful skill in life. So this begins to actually really align you with life rather than always having to fight against it. So trust isn't passive, it's active alignment with the deeper intelligence that's always unfolding around you. But because we're always so closed and stuck in survival mode as human beings, we're kind of in spiral dynamics first tier as a species, very dominantly, we are just blind to the utter wisdom of life itself, the utter intelligence of being or existence. So here's my call to action at the end of this video. I want you to notice how much you actually resist life and struggle against it. I want you to notice how much suffering you create for yourself that is just simply not needed, how unnecessary a lot of it actually is. I want you to actually look into how tense your body can be as well. Notice that you chronically have it in various holding patterns. Maybe your shoulders are raised, your heart feels numb, maybe your entire body feels kind of numb. You're always just kind of lost in thoughts. Your gut is clenched and kind of held and tense. Your legs can be tense. Everything is tense. It can be numb. Maybe some areas feel alive and like there's energy flowing in them sometimes, but there can be a lot of numbness and disconnection. Like, does your gut feel like you, or does your actual gut feel like something distinct from you? Does your body feel like this sort of object that you actually have, or do you feel your actual subjectivity within your body? Do you actually feel alive inside of it and like you're present in it, or do you feel like you're just kind of like this like floating head almost like on a stick, and it's just like this sort of object to your experience you got to like lug around? So that's it for this video. If you're interested in working with me, you can apply to do so. Link is in the pinned comment. I'm doing one-to-one coaching. Take it easy.